To Revelation chapter 12. Now, if you've not been with us for a few weeks, or if you've not been with us at all, if this is your first time here, I have to give you a disclaimer this morning. We are in a series on the book of Revelation, and if you're just picking up in chapter 12, it's going to seem very strange to you this morning. So I apologize for that ahead of time. We've been in this series since July, and we're going to continue in this series all the way through the end of the year. And so I would encourage you, if you are going to be joining us on a number of occasions, maybe to go online. There's a URL there in your bulletin. You can find a place where you can go and find all of the sermons, and I think it'll be helpful for you to do that if you're going to continue on with us. But I do want to take just a moment and to recap where we've been, just to kind of pull everybody up to speed, and I think it'll help. And again, this particular chapter is a good one to kind of take on its own, but it will help us understand the context of what we're reading here. This is the 13th week in Revelation, and again, it would be nearly impossible for me to cover every aspect of the story. So let's just kind of review in broad strokes what Revelation is all about. The word revelation in Greek is the word apocalypsis, means apocalypse, and often we think of that as being kind of the end of time, but really that word simply means to peer into or to pull the veil back so we're able to see into this other dimension. And John is recording for us this vision that he has, this peek into another dimension. And so he's taken by the Spirit into the throne room of God, and you might remember he sees all sorts of creatures and symbolic language describing what he is seeing there. And each week as we've been walking through the story, we've seen layer upon layer in the story. The short of it is that John sees a scroll, and this scroll is the story of God. And it doesn't seem like anybody's going to be able to open the scroll, but then we're told that there is a lamb looking as if he had been slain, who is worthy to open the scroll. Now the scroll, once it is open, contains all sorts of evil, and this evil is unleashed on the earth, not before God seals his people. And the crazy thing is when God's wrath is unleashed on the earth, no one comes to repentance. And we talked about that. It seems like, why all this death? Why all this destruction? Why all these plagues? Because no one seems to be turning around as a result of it. And then John is taken back, or John comes down from heaven, and then he eats a scroll. By the way, if you don't understand what that means, let me encourage you to go back and watch that sermon to help you understand. But he eats this scroll, and then last week in Revelation chapter 11, we encountered this strange story of two witnesses who were killed. Bodies exposed, and they're raised to life. And we're thinking, what in the world is this all about? Where does this fit in the entire story? And as we begin to understand that these witnesses really represent the church, and God's redemptive plan is really about the church being killed, and being able to witness to the life that is given through Jesus' death and resurrection, then at the end of that story, people are repenting. People are giving glory to God. And we're beginning to get, okay, this is how this thing is working out. Are you with me so far? Maybe you're going, not really. But those are, again, broad strokes. That helps us be kind of caught up in the story. And today we come to another strange chapter. But as we continue in this chapter, again, you're going to see more layers added to the story. And again, we're just a little over halfway through all of this story. So I hope you'll stick with us. I'm going to ask Levi to come now and read Revelation chapter 12. I'm going to ask him to read the first 6 verses. And so if you're reading along, leave your Bibles open, and we'll talk about those first 6 verses, and then we'll come back and he'll read the rest of the chapter, and then we'll talk about that together.
A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child in the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days.
All right. Thank you, Levi. So, seems kind of strange, doesn't it? And you got to understand, John is again speaking in apocalyptic language. And so if we can understand that, we can understand that the images that he is displaying are symbols for us to understand something. He says, a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. That's what he says in verse 1 there. Now look back at Luke chapter 21. I'll put this verse on the screen. Jesus told us there will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events. Now we've seen all of that in Revelation so far, haven't we? And then he says, and great signs from heaven. That same language is used here in verse 1. A great and wondrous sign. And we see a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. What's all this about, right? And it says in verse 2 that she was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. So we're thinking, okay, woman pregnant. Who do we think of when we think of pregnant woman in the Bible? Anybody? Mary, exactly. But the woman's not Mary. You're going to see in just a few minutes. Others have said, well, maybe the woman represents Eve, right? She's the mother of all of creation. And so in some ways there is a connection with Eve. But as you read this, you begin to understand that the woman really represents the messianic people of God throughout all of history. She is pregnant. There's hope that one day a Messiah will come. We read throughout the Old Testament. The prophets are proclaiming there's going to be a Messiah, not yet here. And so the woman, let me encourage you to see her as this messianic people of God. And she's pregnant. She's about to give birth. And he said, well, how do we know this? Well, again, this is an interpretation, and you can probably read about 4 or 5 more interpretations, okay? But I'm just going to walk with this one. And one of the key ways that we understand her as the people of God is that she's wearing a crown. And how many stars are in her crown? How many? 12. And we see over and over again, don't we, that the number 12 points us to the people of God. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. She's wearing 12 stars in her crown. So again, I hope you'll understand her in that way. And now look at verse 3. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. Now, again, this would make a great movie, wouldn't it? The imagery here is vivid. Pregnant woman. Now we have this great red dragon, and no ordinary dragon, but one who has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. I mean, what's this all talking about here? Let me tell you, the word dragon or the word Leviathan that you might have seen in the Old Testament is often used to describe the serpent, the evil one. Let me show you a few verses here. This is Psalm chapter 74, verse 14. It says, "It was you who crushed the heads of the Leviathan and gave him as food to the creatures of the desert." And in this psalm here, Egypt is the one referenced as the Leviathan. Now, in Isaiah, both Assyria and Babylon, who we know are enemies of Israel, and enemies of the people of God, are referenced and pictured in the same way. Look at Isaiah 27. "In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea." The word Leviathan is a dragon-like creature. And here John envisions this red dragon. No doubt he's evil. No doubt he represents the evil one. And again, he has how many heads? Got to make sure you're paying attention. How many? 7, exactly. That's the complete number, right? So he's completely evil. And then he has 10 horns. What's all that about? Well, we do know that in Daniel chapter 7, there is a beast mentioned there. And that beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. And we're told in Daniel 7 that the 10 horns represent 10 kings who will enact evil on the earth. And so maybe that's what we're getting at here. Now we're going to learn more about this dragon as we get deeper into Revelation. But we read in verse 4, his tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that she might devour her child at the moment it was born. What's all this about? Now you might know, if you've been walking with us so far, if you're a student of the Bible, that often angels are represented as stars, or the word stars represents angels. And in fact, Satan himself is called the what? Morning star. And we read in Isaiah 14, you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You've been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. And so some scholars point to the connection of this verse with what we understand as the fall of Satan. And again, in Jewish thought, there were a third of the angels that fell with him. And so this is probably an allusion to that sort of thing. So again, we could just stop in any place here and dig into it. So I'm going to keep moving because we want to get through this whole chapter this morning. But the important point here in verse 4 is that the dragon is ready to devour the child of the woman. Pregnant woman, you with me? Red dragon who wants to devour the child. And we keep reading. The child is born. Now, again, we need to realize and we need to remember, John is speaking in symbolic language here. Woman and dragon are symbols, but there are also real historical events that line up with the imagery that we're reading here. Look at how John describes the birth. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Now let's just pause there for a moment. I want to show you this verse, Psalm chapter 2, verse 9. This is a reference to the Messiah. And Andy, I'll let you put that slide up there. Psalm 2. You will rule them with what? An iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Again, this is talking about the Messiah. This is the same language that we read here in verse 5. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. So I think what we need to understand here is, again, the woman is the messianic people of God. She gives birth to the Messiah. We know that Jesus is born, and when he is born, the moment that he is born, evil is ready to snatch him up. Do you remember what happened when Jesus was born? Herod moved in, and what did he do? He killed all of the male children in Bethlehem, trying to take out this child. We also know that Satan was involved throughout Jesus' life, trying to tempt him, trying to throw him off track. And even the cross was an attempt by the evil one to take out the child. How many of you ever seen the movie, The Passion of the Christ? You seen that movie? One of the things that I appreciate about that movie is the way in which Mel Gibson depicts Satan. Do you remember the different depictions of Satan in that movie? I mean, creepy to say the least, right? Creepy ways that Satan appears. But you can kind of see in that Satan is trying to take out. And I think what John is seeing here is this imagery that represents for us this dragon trying to take out the child. And as we think about this, we know that Jesus is not taken out. His death, in fact, becomes salvation for us. And what does he do? He conquers death. He rises from the dead, and then he what? Ascends into heaven. And I think we have imagery here that describes Jesus' ascension. He was taken up to heaven. The dragon, though, will not rest. He continues to pursue the child's followers, the child's offspring. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. And as we continue in the story, we read in verse 6, the woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, if you were here last week, you might notice the number there is significant. It's the same number that we talked about last week. So again, the woman, again, not Mary here, not Eve, but rather the faithful people of God, the community of the Messiah. The dragon is out to get her, and she is taken into the wilderness for how long? 1,260 days. And we talked last week we talked about the fact that this is how long? 3.5 years. And 3.5 is half of what? 7. And in fact, that 1,260 days is a symbolic number that describes a temporary period of time. A period of time that will not last forever. And as we get into this, you're going to see how this unpacks here. And we also have this reference to the wilderness. What do you think that's alluding to? Where are the people of God rescued? They're rescued out of Egypt and they're taken into where? The wilderness. So you can kind of see the dynamics that's going on there. Now, the first century church, they're hearing this vision. They're reading it for the first time. And they understand exactly what John is getting at here. This dragon is out to get God's people. The stage is set. Now, the woman is going to continue to be a part of the story. The dragon is going to continue to be a part of the story. We're going to have another woman that comes into the picture a little bit later on. But the dragon is going to remain in the story of the next few chapters. Let's keep going with the story. Levi, I'm going to ask you to come back here and read verses 7 through 17.
And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, Now have come the salvation, and the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. Then the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth. He pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for times and a half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river, to overtake the woman and sweep her away from the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth, and swallowed the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman, and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus.
All right, as we read this, we can kind of see, and let me remind you, we're talking about two dimensions here, aren't we? We're talking about the things that happen in our dimension, historical events, and then we're talking about another dimension, a heavenly dimension, where things are happening outside of time and space. So let's talk about that for a moment. I don't think we can fully grasp all that we're reading and understanding here. It's really beyond our comprehension. But I wonder if what is happening here and what has happened in that other dimension is impacting what's happening here in our dimension. We read of this battle. Look at verse 7. There was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. Now, earlier on in this chapter, we had a reference to this falling of the stars, but here we have this battle between Michael and his angels. Now, in Jewish literature, we read of this story of Satan attempting to overthrow God. And in turn, Michael and his angels war against Satan. Now, I think this is an allusion to this battle. And then we read in verse 8, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. So we know the dragon, who was where? In heaven, is cast out of heaven. Yet, we read in numerous places in Scripture that Satan has access to heaven. So what's the deal? Is he cast out, or does he still have access? You might remember in Job that Satan is standing before the throne of God accusing Job, right? In Zechariah, the same sort of dynamic. Satan standing before God accusing God's servants. We read in verse 9, the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. One translation translates it as the Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Again, we're talking about two dimensions here. You might be saying, what's going on here? Is this something that happened in the past? Is it something that's happening now? Is it something that's going to happen one day in the future? Yes, all of those things. And that's what we're getting at here. This is a story that continues to play out. It's happening outside of time and space in another dimension, but it's impacting what we're dealing with in our world today. You might remember when Jesus sent the 72 disciples out in Luke chapter 10. Do you remember that story? And Jesus said to them in Luke 10 verse 3, "Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves." How many of you want that job, right? You want to be a lamb among the wolves? Not pretty dangerous, right? But they go out, and they do all sorts of wonderful things. And they come back, and look in verse 17. The 72 returned with joy and said, "Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name." And look at what Jesus says here in verse 18. He replied, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." You see the connection there? What Jesus is saying here is that the dragon is being hurled down. He is recounting what possibly has already happened in terms of our time and space, right? But it's happening in another dimension. The dragon has been hurled down. The dragon is falling. But we need to keep this image front and center. He's still active and still moving, right? He continues to work and move in our world. And it doesn't take long for us to realize evil has not been defeated, right? I mean, we turn the news on and we see evil in our world. We could walk down the street and a couple of blocks around town today, and it wouldn't take long for us to see evil in our world. And so we're going, okay, the dragon is cast down, but yet he still seems to be active. Think of the first century Christians. They were being killed for their faith. They were reading this and they were thinking, yeah, the dragon has been cast down, but he's still wreaking havoc on us. You know, my uncle was killed last week, one might say, in the first century, right? Just because he was a follower of Jesus. The dragon is still alive and well. And then John hears this loud voice in verse 10. Look at what it says. "Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say," I like that, kind of a megaphone voice, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down." So the dragon continues to accuse God's people, but he's ultimately defeated. You see, the first century Christians were living in between, weren't they? The dragon's been hurled down, but he's not yet ultimately defeated. And they're still experiencing the dragon. He says in verse 11, "They overcame him." How? "By the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death." This is very pertinent in the first century. As these churches would have read these words, they would have said, yes, we're going to overcome the dragon. How's that going to happen? By our testimony, by the blood of a lamb. His blood was shed for us, and many of them were shedding their blood for Christ. John is speaking into the reality of the first century here. Again, the dragon is trying to take them out, and the Christians are being killed. Look at verse 12. "Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short." His time is short. That's a key part of that. As we continue the story, verses 13 through the end of the chapter, we see one angry dragon. Look at verse 13. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So he's going after who? The woman. The woman is representative of the messianic people of God. And then in verse 14, we see the woman given wings like an eagle. She is escaping the dragon. Where does she go? She goes to the wilderness. Again, a reference to the Exodus story here. Do you see how God's story is a continual reflection on what has been, what is, and what will be? We see that over and over again. The Exodus was one way in which God saved His people at a particular point in history. But Jesus, even when He came to the table, He redefines the Exodus by saying to His disciples, "It's my blood shed for you. My body broken for you, my blood shed for you." Passover lamb, one image. Jesus on a cross. Again, another part of our story. And this is, again, a dragon and a woman. And so we have all of these different images here. And then the people of God are protected from the enemy. The serpent opens his mouth, spews out a river, but the earth responds by doing what? Protecting, by swallowing up the river. It's kind of like a cat and mouse chase here, isn't it? We get the dragon pursuing the woman, and then the dragon really gets ticked off. But God protects His people. And then look at verse 17. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring. So we got the messianic community, the woman, right, giving birth to the Messiah. And now we have the child's offspring. And look at how it's described here. Those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Is that you? Is that me? Yeah. Who's coming after us now? The dragon. He's ticked off. He's upset. He's angry. He's been hurled down. He is ultimately defeated. But yet, he's moving and acting and out to destroy you and me. As we read this story, we're getting an idea that this is what's happening behind the scenes, right? And again, we might ask the question, when did this happen? Is it happening now? Is it one day going to happen? Most of the time when we read Revelation, we think it's all about something out there in the future, right? It's going to happen one day, and maybe I'll figure it out. And if I don't, it's going to happen anyway, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. That's what we often think of when we think of Revelation. I don't really understand it, but I know one day it's all going to come to fruition. But as we get into it, we begin to understand that it's not just about what's going to happen one day. It's about what's happened in the past, what's happening now, and what's going to happen one day. And so in this story right here, we're seeing these images from long ago, right? Satan falling from heaven. I think that happened, at least in our perspective, in time and space, way before, right? Because the serpent is in the garden, right? And he's evil then. So we're thinking, but here's the point. The point is we don't have to figure out when it happens and in what order it happens, because this is not a chronological description of events. It's images or glimpses of what's going on. We're getting these glimpses. The dragon, he's alive. He's pursuing the woman. He's ticked off. He's angry. He's been hurled down. He's been defeated. There was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels defeated him. He wasn't strong enough to defeat them, but he's accusing God's people. But the Lamb is redeeming His people. How? Through His blood and the witness of their testimony. And they're being killed. You see how all of it coming together here and how it all fits? And we say, well, what about us? What does this have to do with us in 2019? Well, we may not be like the first century church. Our lives may not be on the line because we're Christians. So we may not have the same sort of dynamic, but let me tell you, the dragon's alive and well, isn't he? And he's out to get you and me. And we need to know that. And we need to understand that. We need to expect that. You know, John wrote this letter to the church in Ephesus, 1 John chapter 3. And he said this, "Do not be surprised, my brothers, if the world hates you." And I would add to that, if the dragon hates you. Peter put it this way using another image. Peter said this, "Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." Now that's another image, isn't it? Red dragon, roaring lion. Which one do you want to go up against? They're both pretty scary, aren't they? And as we begin to think about this, we need to understand the evil one is alive and well. He is a defeated evil one. His time is short, but yet he is on the prowl. He's out to get us. He's out to destroy us. And I wonder this morning if we might think of ways in which the evil one is out to get us. Maybe this afternoon or tonight or tomorrow, you would sense temptation in your life, and it would be strong. And it would pull you into a place where you don't want to be, and you feel the weight of this dragon on you. The message of the word this morning is to call on the blood of the Lamb, to call on the power of the one who is King, to help you defeat the dragon's accusations. Maybe as you go out into the world this week, you will see the work of the dragon in and around you. And you may have this feeling of hopelessness or despair. And you might think, what's happening here? What are we going to do about this? How's God ever going to win? How's the kingdom of God ever going to come to fruition in this place? And might we be reminded that the dragon has been defeated, but he is angry. And he is doing all the damage that he can do. As we get into this book, and as we get into this story, as we continue in Revelation, this is going to play out. You're going to see all these different pieces of the dragon and what he does and how he moves. And you're going to see beasts coming into the picture and a prostitute and all kinds of crazy images as we get into this. But it's all going to make sense, I think, as we begin to walk through it chapter by chapter. Now, in a minute, we're going to come to a time of response here. But before I do that, I'm going to fast forward, okay? So will you let me just pause here for a moment? And let me invite some of you. I have 10 pieces of paper right here, okay? And in a few weeks, we're going to be walking through this story. We're going to come to a Sunday when we focus on things that we worship or could worship in opposition to God. And you might even phrase this as things that might serve as idols in your life, right? I'd like to clarify it this way. These are the things in your life that you give your time, your attention, and your money to. Can you think about what that might be? Not God, but other things. Maybe it's sports or shopping or a particular, maybe video games. I don't know what it is, but something you give your time, your attention, and your money to. And I've got 10 of these, and I'd like for 10 of you to volunteer to be a part of this. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take one of these home. I'm going to get a little piece of paper so I know who's taking these too, so I can communicate with you about this. And I'd like for you to write one word on this piece of paper, large enough for everyone to read. And then if you want to decorate it, if you want to take a magazine like you did in school and put pictures around it, that would be fine. This is not an art project, though. It is a spiritual exercise, okay? And then I'd like for you to be transparent enough on the 27th to be able to walk forward holding this sign up, confessing, this is something that I tend to worship. And then we're going to lay these down at the feet of Jesus together, confessing that only He is worthy of our worship. So I wonder, is there 10 here that would be transparent, that would be willing to take a sheet of paper home, to pray over it, to ask God to reveal what it is in your heart that you tend to give your time, your money, and attention to other than God, and then to write that word down and to bring it forward as a confession of faith on the 27th. So after church, you who would be willing to do that, you come and see me, and I'm going to give you a piece of paper, okay? As the band comes forward now, we're going to enter a time of communion.